1763, a Native American uprising began against the British. It encompassed over 10 native tribes of the Great Lakes region, Illinois, and Ohio countries. Their goal was simple: force the British out. The conflict was led by the Ottawa chief Pontiac, whose name bears this event: Pontiac's Rebellion, or Pontiac's War.
Pontiac was an Ottawa leader born in 1720 into a family of chiefs. He came from mixed parentage. His father was Ottawa and his mother was Ojibwa. This lineage gave Pontiac a great deal of influence because he was related to two powerful Great Lakes tribes. According to Richard Middleton, there are two views on Pontiac. The first was that he was a great pan-Indian leader and the Indians should have listened to his warnings about white Europeans. The second was that he was a minor figure who didn't really do anything and was forgotten by everybody, including his own people. Many Europeans, including men like Generals Amherst and Gage, saw Pontiac as a great Indian leader. Pontiac was a brave warrior who fought against the British in a battle at Fort Duquesne. After the British were victorious, Pontiac was promised riches. All he received, however, was an outpouring of rum, an increase in the price of goods, and an influx of colonials moving into the Ohio River Valley. After this horrendous display of behavior, Pontiac declared the British liars and began to advocate for war.
Under French rule, the Indians of the Great Lakes region practically knew peace. The French crown was not interested in much in colonizing, but mainly wanted to export goods, mainly fur, back to France.
The European and Native American relationship was established when French Samuel de Champlain came over to the New World looking for the waterway to China. He didn't find it, but he did establish trade with several tribes in the region. It was at this time that the native tribes vastly outnumbered the Europeans, which made trade very easy. This trade was built on fictive kin relationships with the Europeans that established them as part of the tribe, and Europeans respected this tradition. They often lived with the Native American tribes on their trade route. They often married into these tribes to establish firmer trade relationships. When forts began to be established in the area, they again did not live separately. It was common for 12 to 15 fur traders to bring their Native American wives to the fort to live permanently, and these Native American brides brought with them their traditions. They would hunt and prepare the traditional foods that they had done for generations. The Jesuits that helped establish these forts were fine with this tradition so long as the Native American women converted to Catholicism. This also provided an opportunity to establish more fictive kin relationships by introducing the Native American brides as godparents to other children. It was in these ways that the French established their social benefit system rather than one of profit. The British relationship, on the other hand, was much different.
Because the aim of the French was not to colonize, many of the French fur traders began to marry within Native American society, which kept relations very smooth. It wasn't until the British came that relations really started to deteriorate.
Their relationship was built on very unstable ground, with many of them believing that the Native American peoples were brutish and unruly and incapable of managing their land properly. In fact, the ranger, Robert Rogers, wrote a book several years later called A Concise Account of North America, in which he states, "Nor do I see any reason why this should not become a rich and valuable country should it ever be inhabited by a civilized people." Furthermore, during the French and Indian War, many of the native tribes in the Great Lakes region had fought against the British on the side of the French, their allies. To gain more Native American aid, the British had promised them a preservation of land in the Great Lakes region where they would not encroach. At the end of the war, they were also expected by these Native American tribes to cover the dead. This was a tradition wherein the opposing side that had slaughtered many of their tribesmen were expected either to cover their dead by providing goods or payment for those that had been killed, or open themselves up to revenge. However, the British did not see the tradition this way, and did not respect it. The Treaty of Easton, which established the boundaries of the preservation of land promised by the British, was further encroached on after the war, with colonials who did not agree with the treaty, encroaching onto the land without repercussions of the British, further angering the Native American groups. On top of these frictions that already existed, there were many trades, such as rum and rifles, that were not made in good faith with Native American troops, further causing the friction. All of these were in place and in the minds of the native groups when Pontiac began his rise to fame.
To gain support for his attack on Detroit, Pontiac used the vision of the prophet Nealon. Nealon called for Indians to give up everything that was European and to return to a more traditional Indian way of life. His actions inspired Indian uprisings across the United States. Pontiac was also a very trustworthy and honorable man. When he needed supplies for his men, he signed promissory notes on birch bark and gave them to people in exchange for supplies. After the fighting was done, Pontiac paid back all of the debts he owed.
When Amherst came into his position in the Americas, there was a lot of pressure from the British government to cut back on their expenditures and increase the profitability of the region. This was a major departure from the way the French had run the region, and the natives of the area had become accustomed to. Amherst chose to implement these changes in immediate order and without explaining anything to the chiefs in the area. These changes included occupying the French posts, curtailment of gift giving, and the demand of prisoners' return. While on the surface these seemed like reasonable changes, they were anything but to the Native Americans.
The natives saw these changes as vastly unreasonable. When the gift-giving stopped, this severely degraded the authority of the chiefs in the region, which gave further authority to the already enraged warrior class. The prisoners the British demanded back from the Indians were mostly integrated into their society. Many of the women had married native men and even borne them children. The initial understanding was that those who wished to stay behind would be allowed to do so, while those that wished to return to their British kin would be returned. This understanding was later dissolved when the British demanded all prisoners returned. The natives were also further confused by the new haggling that took place over British goods that had been asked for by the British.
Amherst was not a friend of the Indians, and he seemed to constantly underestimate their abilities. He even told William Johnson in a letter that they never gave me a moment's concern, as I know their incapacity of attempting anything serious. He began to understand just how wrong he was when papers reporting the attacks made across the Midwest reached him. Who was Pontiac up against at Fort Detroit?
Well, it was Major Gladwin. He was a man not easily frightened and would not back down from a challenge. You see this in the way he conducts himself and orders his troops. He learned of the attack on Fort Detroit ahead of time, but he let the Indians in the fort anyway. He calculated that his provisions and preparations were adequate and would be able to scare off the Indians. Either that or the Indians would engage in a battle that was disadvantageous to them. Gladwin was the type of man that would hold the fort to the last man, never questioning whether his country was in the right or wrong. He knows that Pontiac does not want to risk a frontal engagement because it would cost too many lives. There seems to be numerous times during the siege of Detroit where Pontiac has overwhelming numbers and chooses against to overrun the fort in hopes of a victory with minimal losses. It can be said that Gladwin was the spark to start the war. He had disdain for the Indians and stopped the fort's gunsmith from fixing the Indians' guns. Gladwin tried and executed a Panis Indian slave woman for being an accomplice to a murder of an English trader. The execution was done in accordance with Amherst's orders to be a public execution to deter anyone from committing the crime in the future. Gladwin only worries about the temper of the Indians after the execution.
Pontiac had fought against the British in the French and Indian War. With France's defeat, Pontiac soon began lobbying to the Native American tribes to rise up against the British.
On April 27th, 1863, Pontiac met on the shore of the Ecorse River with the other area tribal leaders that included Huron, Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. Chief Pontiac wanted the tribes to join forces and force the British out. it was believed that the other tribes agreed to carry out these sieges throughout the summer all over the Midwest to take over the British forts.
The native forces could not sustain long sieges and mainly tried taking the forts through deception. Pontiac led the attack against Fort Detroit, the most significant fort in the region, for both the British and the Native Americans. Success at Detroit would mean overall success in the campaign.
Pontiac's ruse to get into the fort was under the pretense that he and other tribal leaders were there to discuss a peaceful resolution to their differences. However, Pontiac had 10 chiefs, 60 other warriors concealing weapons under their clothing that will intend to be used to slaughter the British troops with a single sign from Pontiac. Gladwin's counter plan was if Pontiac made his signal, the British troops would slaughter with all the Indians. Wisely, Pontiac never gave the signal, sparing any slaughter from taking place that day. Pontiac wanted to meet with the commander again on May 8th, but it was turned down. So on May 10th, Pontiac started a siege against Fort Detroit that lasted till October 31st of the same year.
The British seemed to be very fortunate to have replaced Donald Campbell with Henry Gladwin as commander of Fort Detroit. We can only speculate as to how well Campbell would have defended the fort. Campbell cared more for the Indians than either Gladwin or Amherst. Amherst decided to cut off supplies of rum and severely reduce the amount of gunpowder given to the Indians in 1762. Campbell was the only one that was smoothing things over with the Indians when Amherst instituted the new Indian policy. He gave the Indians gifts of tobacco, rum, and some powder, along with diplomatic speeches to calm down the Indians. Near this time, the gunsmith had arrived at the fort, ready to prepare Indians' guns. To help and ease tensions even more, 200 hoes were given to the Hurons. A man named Dalyell sailed in to reinforce and resupply the British at Fort Detroit. Now, Dalyell seemed to be full of success at successfully navigating and arriving at Fort Detroit without any trouble. Within 48 hours, he proposes to Gladwin that they attempt a surprise attack by night march to Pontiac's camp. Gladwin is against this. Even though he is of high rank, he was of inferior regiment and social status. So he feels compelled to give the okay against his better judgment. Gladwin had been successful for several months using his defensive strategy to hold the fort, and rely on the fact that the Indians would not commit to a full frontal assault on the fort. Pontiac learns of the surprise attack and ends up ambushing them instead. Pontiac and his men end up routing the British army and kill Captain James Dalyell in the process. Fun fact, in Michigan, Gladwin County is named for Major Henry Gladwin. The county was named in 1831 and organized in 1875.
The Indian uprising that began at Detroit soon spread all across the western frontier as other British forts came under attack. One of the most brilliant attacks came at the Straits of Mackinac. On June 2, 1763, Captain George Etherington and about 40 British soldiers at Fort Michilimackinac watched as the visiting Sauk Indians challenged the Ojibwa to a game of lacrosse in front of the fort. Although warned by a local fur trader that he should be suspicious of the Indians, Etherington ignored the advice. The fort's gates that were left open and the soldiers' muskets stood unloaded. Indian women, who were wearing blankets on this hot, humid day, watched the game. Several times the ball was thrown over the fort's walls and retrieved. One time after the ball flew over the fort, the Indians grabbed tomahawks, knives, and clubs that had been concealed beneath the women's blankets and attacked. The Native Americans captured the fort in a matter of minutes. One British trader who watched the attack later wrote, "The dead were scalped and mangled. The die were writhing and shrieking under the knives of the tomahawks." 17 Englishmen were killed in the attack.
In the end, Pontiac's cause had failed. The Native Americans were successful in taking many small forts, but the full campaign hinged on the ability to take Fort Detroit, which Pontiac failed to do. The failure at Detroit left the British too big of a foothold in the Great Lakes region, enabling them to strike native forces throughout the region and stay well supplied.
Pontiac also became a peaceful man. In 1765, he agreed to bury the hatchet with the British. He officially accepted his peace at the Great Council in 1766. He even promoted a pro-British attitude in the late 1760s, telling his people that the British had changed and were trustworthy. This pro-British attitude did not sit well with all of his people. Some Indians were worried by Pontiac's attitude and viewed him as a weak traitor. Indians who felt betrayed by Pontiac's change of heart murdered him in Illinois in 1769.
Pontiac's rebellion serves as the only sustained resistance to British rule by Native Americans.
Go.
To help and ease tension.
The Indians of the Great Lakes region had known practically
This understanding was...
Never gaining victory to the fort.
Huh?
Hold it a little lower so that I'm not looking like a little bit more. A little bit more. Okay.
On the morning of May 7th, already started. All right. Okay.
Wow, maybe